Hello, my name is Destry Seiler, and I was an intern for Water Access Now this past summer in northern Ghana. A little bit of personal background. I have a bachelor's and master's of science degree in civil engineering water resources from Washington State University, and I have experience in development work in Tijuana, Mexico, an indigenous village in Panama, and now northern Ghana. When I was working for Water Access Now, I was working in conjunction with Catholic Relief Services, who are the feet on the ground in Ghana installing these wells that Water Access Now is funding. And I'd like to describe my observations this past summer by talking about the science behind sustainability. Now, sustainability is a hot topic these days. It's a word that gets tossed around a lot, but as an engineer, I think it's very important to define your terms. My favorite definition is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. We're going to break that down even further into social, environmental, and economic components. Sometimes identifying the need can be a little bit tricky, but in the case of water, it's very simple. If you don't have water, you need it. I was able to conduct need assessment visits with Catholic Relief Services where we visited communities to see if their need was severe enough to qualify them for a well within the upcoming year. In one of those visits, I was able to meet Joseph, kind of the acting chief of his village, and he spoke very passionately about the ways his people were suffering without water. That need was very apparent. Needs can look different for different people. For example, Jessica was the mother of a newborn baby, and she told me that after giving birth in the village, women might help her fetch water for a day or two, but after that, it was up to the new mother to find water on her own. And so Jessica felt that she needed water so that her baby didn't cry as long while she was out fetching water. In the terms of identifying the social need for water, Water Access Now has truly identified a region in serious need. Moving on to the environmental component, we have a classic hydrologic cycle here. You can see the clouds with rain going down onto the snow in the mountains. That runoff feeds streams and rivers, some of which finds its way to the ocean, some of it feeds plants, and that water is then evaporated back into the atmosphere. Some of that water ends up making its way into groundwater or aquifers. An aquifer is just an area underground where water is stored. And eventually, sometimes boreholes are drilled into those aquifers to bring water from below the surface up to the surface where people can drink it. You can see here in this graphic, it represents the pipe that would bring the water from the aquifer to the surface. And whenever you're pumping water, it creates a cone of depression. If you have a healthy groundwater system where water is being recharged into the aquifer, that's not a problem, it's nothing to worry about. However, if you have an area where water isn't being recharged or you're not sure, sometimes that cone of depression can have negative impacts on the surrounding ecosystem. It's just like if you were to stick a straw into a wet sponge and suck all the water out. If you're putting more water into the sponge, that's totally fine. But if you're sucking all the water out and not putting any more water in, you're going to have a dry, crinkly sponge, which is not what you want when you're talking about a natural environment. The reason why that's so important to consider in this part of the world is shown in this figure here, which shows groundwater availability and accessibility in the northern parts of Ghana that Water Access Now is working in. You can see here that there's a lot of pinks and blues, which means that there's not very high groundwater availability in this region. So it's very important to be considering how much water we're pumping out of the ground from these boreholes, because as we learned from the hydrologic cycle, groundwater is one of the only viable water resources available in this region. So as we're pumping out water to solve present needs, we need to be thinking about how that will affect future generations trying to pump out water from the same source. Moving on to the economic need, I'd like to take an angle of climate change. Because while climate change is out of our hands, how we prepare for future ramifications due to climate change is a matter of economics. That's something that we can fund with our own economic resources. The climate change phenomenon that's affecting this part of the world, one of the climate change phenomena affecting this part of the world is the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. Now you can see here in this graphic on the left, the red box is called Niño 3.4. That's an area of the ocean between Australia and Central America, and when scientists observe that the sea surface temperature or pressure is rising above average values, that is indicating an ENSO event or an El Niño event if that temperatures are higher than normal. Those are proven to affect weather circulation patterns in a way that causes extended droughts in Ghana. Now, going back to our hydrologic cycle and groundwater availability, that's not a good thing in northern regions of Ghana. I'd like you to note on this right-hand graphic that there is a recorded ENSO event in 2017 on the very right of that graph, which will become important in just a few moments. While it can be a little daunting to try and think about how you can support sustainability right now and in the future, accounting for climate change, if you can find a way to economically support that, you can change dreams into reality. For example, this junior high school principal used to dream of days when his students wouldn't have to leave the classroom to find water. And because of funds from Water Access Now, his dream became a reality this past summer. We were able to install a well at his junior high school in July. You also have people like Joshua, who is a 25-year-old who has dedicated his life to improving the development of his community so that they no longer have to dig holes in the street to find water. He's 25 years old. He has dedicated his life to getting a degree in education so that he can continue teaching his community about ways to improve their lives. So the economics has a huge impact in this part of the world in the water crisis. So we've talked about the components of sustainability, but why choose Water Access Now? There are so many organizations trying to solve this problem. Why Water Access Now? And as an engineer, I needed hard data. So I did a formal analysis on 20 boreholes installed by Water Access Now as early as 2012. Of those 20 boreholes, 50% had no problems at all. 25% had breaks that were fixable within 3 weeks of the break. 15% showed a drop in yield, and only 10% were not in use or operation. Now, the drop in yield just means that the community reported they weren't getting as much water from their well or were having to pump longer to find water, but that could really be attributed to the hydrologic processes or climate change scenarios that we've talked about earlier. So really, not counting a drop in yield, for my test sample, the Water Access Now boreholes had a 90% success rate. I was also curious how these boreholes were affecting other parts of people's lives. So I went to the Talensi District Health Directorate to ask about records for reported cases of diarrhea, cholera, typhoid fever, malaria, and dysentery. And while internet connection made it hard to find extensive historical data, from the data they were able to give to me, it's pretty clear that there's a significant drop in reported illnesses. And I think that could be attributed to the boreholes that Water Access Now is installing in conjunction with the world-class water and sanitation hygiene programs that CRS is conducting in the area as well. There is a spike in 2017, but that can be attributed to the ENSO event, which has been proven to cause an increase in waterborne illnesses. So it's pretty clear that the boreholes Water Access Now are installing are having measurable impacts in these communities. So sustainability, meeting the needs of the future without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. And it was clear to me that Water Access Now is addressing the social, environmental, and economic components of sustainability in their solutions. And I'd like to end off with this man from a Nabisi community who, without any formal education, is already noticing the effects that climate change is having on his water availability. He knows that not having clean water is making his people sick, but he also believes that with the help of Water Access Now and Catholic Relief Services, a borehole in his community could be his savior. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you again to Water Access Now for providing me with this opportunity.